Sorabas. Zbudaje, doktor.
Good afternoon. Sugar, can we start? Should we start? Should we start? Huh? Okay. Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I suggest we start our event. Okay. So good afternoon, and welcome to this event on actions for scaling up effective investments in climate adaptation and resilience. We are all here at the COP, and I think all of us are very, very aware about the urgent need to really scale up investments in adaptation. But we've also seen the latest IPCC report. There's a lot of learning on what's happening in the space of adaptation, and a really urgent call for the need to move away from sort of fragmented and to really start supporting investment in actions that enable system transitions or transformation. We've also heard a lot about the resources that are going to be required for adaptation and about the financing not being enough, which again calls very much for the need to really start focusing on the effectiveness of our investments in adaptation. So what we're going to do at this session, which is jointly organized by the Asian Development Bank, the Asian Disaster Preparedness Center, and the Japan Water Forum, is what we are hoping to do is really to start a dialogue. We've got an excellent panel of people representing organizations that have been doing some great work in the space of adaptation. But it's to start a discussion, to try to understand or to unpack what are the factors that really enable effective investment in adaptation, and how do we take those factors into account when we are designing adaptation investments and when we are implementing these investments. So with that, I'd like to call on stage our Director General, Bruno, from the Asian Development Bank, to please give the opening remarks.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Nanki. Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, it is indeed my pleasure to be here with you today to give some opening remarks on the actions for scaling effective investments in climate adaptation and resilience. On behalf of the Asian Development Bank, and in partnership with the Asian Disaster Preparedness Center, as well as the Japan Water Forum on actions for scaling up effective investments in climate adaptation and resilience, pleased that all of you could join us today. Impacts on climate change are already quite painfully obvious across Asia and the Pacific region. A few months ago, all of you would have witnessed the devastating floods in Pakistan, and there has been also a number of incidents of extreme drought in many parts of the People's Republic of China. The future likely will bring more of such devastating impacts, and it is now imperative for us to recognize the need for adapting to climate change more than ever before. ADB, of course, has positioned itself as the climate bank for Asia and the Pacific. As part of that, we have made a commitment to raise our level of ambition for climate financing to $100 billion, and that is a commitment of own resources, cumulative over the period 2019 through to 2030. Of that $100 billion, 34, so approximately a little over a third, will be targeting adaptation. And of that 34 billion in adaptation, approximately 10 billion will be sourced from our water sector and our water work. While these resources will be critical to scale up the quantity of climate finance that countries in Asia Pacific need, it is equally important to ensure the quality of financing and making sure that climate financing is leading to effective development outcomes. Adaptation, of course, is inevitably about securing sustainable development outcomes in the face of increasing climate impacts. Therefore, the effectiveness of adaptation action will be determined in terms of climate risks being adequately reduced to result in improved development outcomes for households, communities, and ecosystems. This, of course, requires a range of adaptation actions, and here we're looking at actions that can reduce exposure and vulnerability, such as implementing grey and green infrastructure to reduce such things as risks from flooding in urban areas, or promoting climate-smart farming practices to build resilience of rural farmers deal with droughts. Not so long ago, I am based in Manila. We have the International Rice Research Institute, which is about 100 kilometers down from Manila in Los Baños, and I was exposed to a very interesting variant of rice, and that is called the subaquatic species, or variant, because it can survive many days underwater. So these are some of the climate-smart practices that we need to look at. However, of course, it is increasingly clear that the effectiveness of such adaptation actions will ultimately depend on conditions under which the actions, of course, are being implemented. And here I'd like to highlight 5 important conditions. First, we all need to better understand the medium and long-term risks and the impact across systems and how these risks evolve over time. Secondly, we need to look at how to explicitly focus on reducing the root causes of the vulnerability, especially gendered vulnerabilities. So thorough diagnostics is required. Third, we need to recognize inclusive decision-making processes that bring together stakeholders across the board. Fourth, we need to look at financial systems that align the flow of finance towards greater resilience in development outcomes. 5, we need to look at the selection of effective metrics to be able to better measure and monitor progress. At ADB, we are increasingly ensuring that these adaptation investments are enabling such conditions. I want to give you 3 examples of how we do this. So in the Pacific island countries, very vulnerable countries as such, we are undertaking island-wide multi-hazard assessments to inform the selection of the investments that steer development in resilient directions and do not lock in risks. And we know, of course, the existential threat of climate on many of these small island economies. Turning to Bangladesh, we have recently approved a project to provide financial resources to urban local governments on achievement of performance indicators. So we're increasingly looking at incentives. In this case, these performance indicators seek to strengthen women's participation in resilience-related decision-making processes. Finally, the country where we're based, in the Philippines, we're initiating work to support design and application of adaptation metrics in investment planning. So bringing in the importance of the sound fiscal framework, looking at medium-term budget frameworks, and making sure that those investments are well identified in that process. However, we do recognize that this is just the start, and much work remains to be done. And this is both by way of adaptation investments. How do we better identify such investments? How are they better designed, implemented, monitored, and indeed evaluated so that they can really contribute to effective outcomes? I look forward to today's discussions. We have an excellent set of panelists, and of course we look forward to hearing from them on their experiences in undertaking effective adaptation actions and methodologies and tools available to test such effectiveness. Thank you very much for attending this session, and I look very much forward to active discussion from everyone. Thank you very much.
Bruno, thank you for those excellent opening remarks. And with that, I'd like to invite onto the stage Pilar from the Adaptation Research Alliance. And Pilar is going to set the scene for us. Do you want to set this down?
Thank you very much for the invitation, and it's my pleasure to have the opportunity to provide some remarks representing the Adaptation Research Alliance. So with respect to this very appealing topic that we have today, the opportunity to talk about this concept of effectiveness of adaptation, and effectiveness of adaptation investments. I think that all that path should be understood together in a way. So maybe my first idea here is to say that to understand the effectiveness of adaptation investment, and of course of adaptation per se, is very important after the Paris Agreement to reflect on the Paris Agreement itself and Article 7.14 of the PA. So the effectiveness of adaptation action was included in this context of the adaptation in the global stocktake. So that's an important piece of information to take into account. And the adequacy and effectiveness of adaptation action and support was understood not in isolation in the GST, but also in relation with the other three components of this article. So that is the implementation, and this is an implementation COP that in the Paris Agreement is quite related to the adaptation communications. Of course, the recognition of adaptation actions of developing countries, as well as the review of the progress made with the GGA. So this is a first idea. Then when we also see the literature that is already produce in terms of the effectiveness of adaptation action and the relationship between these and adaptation investments, we will see some commonalities, and I would like to make some comments on this regard. So some of these commonalities include the importance of having global metrics, or in some cases at least generalizable metrics. That is not the same, because we can have common metrics that are not global. So this discussion that is taking place in this COP, for example, in the context of the GGA and also the GST, is also a very important component. But in any case, if we are going to measure and to assess something, always the big question is, what are we going to assess? What are we going to measure? For whom? Which is the purpose, which is the context of all this. So the literature also include these two perspectives of goals or objectives oriented when we talk about the effectiveness of adaptation and of adaptation investments, as well as the focus on process. There are indeed a list, let's say, of issues that we need to take into account, including different approaches, let's say, that effectiveness of adaptation investment should take into account, and for sure some of the panelists will reflect on this. One of them for sure is the importance of being guided and based on the best available science, and probably we will not to give more details on that regard. I have just a couple of minutes, so I will not give a lot of reasons, just to make some comments on this. Also the importance of improving well-being. This is something that appears in most of the literature, as well as the three components of the GGA are reflected in general, including enhancing adaptive capacity, reducing vulnerability, and strengthening resilience for sure. Long-term and different scales or multi-scales approach is also something recognized, including locally led adaptation, national approach for sure, regional, as well as transboundary dimension of adaptation. The three dimensions of sustainability, this is also something that appear in many cases, and I think it's very important to take into account, including also the nature-based solutions, ecosystem-based solutions, and something that the ARA has been trying to, during all this year of work, be very concrete in terms of its proposals, how we co-develop processes and understand research from another view, not only the traditional view of research by institutions, but also how this co-development process with different actors, and in particular community center. So this is also something that for sure it's very important in terms of an approach for understanding and setting the base for effective adaptation investments. Then other 2-3 things that I would like to mention includes equity and justice oriented, and this is also part of IPCC findings, as well as gender responsive approach, and if you allowed me also the importance of human rights oriented approach, that in many cases we see some struggles even in our negotiations nowadays. My last points also are related to the importance of the adaptation policy cycle to be reflected by the project-oriented effectiveness of adaptation investments. We see the opportunity to have the what in a more clear way, but at the same time, these projects, not in all cases, really in developing countries, in our developing countries, sometimes we have some struggle dealing with the project approach versus the adaptation policy cycle approach. So we are trying to show quite how important is to focus in the different stages of this policy approach to help developing countries and communities to build this cycle by their own and to build their narratives, their stories in terms of adaptation action, considering diagnosis, planning, implementation, and of course, monitoring and evaluation, because for sure, tracking and assessing progress is very important, but it's not in isolation. It's not a process that is just to say we need to track and to monitor what is happening because we need to do it. Yes, but it's also anchored to all these other issues that I referred to. My last point here, since I already covered the allocation of time, it's important to refer to transformational adaptation. Again, IPCC anchor, this is very important, and we heard during this last week quite like two separate discussions, negotiation conversations saying this is a concept that is not agreed, we don't know what are you talking about, but then scientists saying, but we all know what is transformational adaptation. Is very important to look for this and to understand what is transformational adaptation on the ground, and in particular for investment, when we talk about effectiveness of adaptation investments. I will leave it for now. I thank you, and of course, very happy to join this very interesting panel. Thanks.
No, you can. So Pilar, thank you for that, and thank you for setting the scene for this session. And with that, I'd like to invite our panelists to come up onto the stage. Like I said, it's a great panel, and we really have a mix of people who've been actually developing and implementing adaptation actions. There are people who've been funding investment in adaptation, and also people who've really been at the forefront of really developing adaptation metrics as well. So Aslam from the Asian Disaster Preparedness Center, Yumiko from the Japan Water Forum, Anne from IISD, Walid from OECD, Luis from FCDO, and Noel from ADB. And of course, our moderator for the panel, Orgo.
Thank you, Nanki, and very good afternoon, everybody. First of all, a big thanks to all of you for attending the session. I think this topic on effectiveness is quite important, but also complicated. And honestly, we don't have an answer over here. So our whole idea is to have a dialogue with our panelists, as well along with all of you, to really identify some of the key conditions that really makes an adaptation investment potentially effective. So I'm very happy to moderate this session. I'll first start with a common question to all our panelists. And if you have about around 2-3 minutes to speak, we'll be really keen to hear from each one of your perspective of one example of an initiative or an investment which you have been associated with or aware of, and which you consider as potentially an effective adaptation investments. So maybe I'll start from the extreme side. Noel, do you want to kick in, please? Thank you.
Thank you, Orgo. Just check the mic. Yes. I think I'm going to focus in today on some work that ADB has been doing in Tonga, where the capital city is Nuku'alofa on the island of Tonga Tapu. The city has evolved on the lowest part of the island, a peninsula, which is surrounded by water on all 3 sides, and much of which it doesn't exceed 1.5, 2 meters. Many of you will have seen it on the news in January when there was the really large volcanic eruption and the island was hit by a tsunami wave. So back in 2018, the request for ADB was to do additional work on drainage management for the city. And when we look at this situation, part of the challenges that we see with sea level rise and with the increased king tides, that we have a challenge of investing in a potentially unsustainable drainage management system. We have the fact that ultimately we may be trying to pump water out into water that is higher, but also the fact that by investing, we can give the false message that this is a safe area for future investments. So then we create a situation where we have lock-in, to avoid that. So in response to that process, so ADB has worked with the last 2 years with the government of Tonga to conduct multi-hazard and disaster risk analysis. We've covered the whole of the island with the analysis because there are areas which are well above 20 meters, up to 65 meters on the island, which we believe are areas that can provide a much more resilient future. So we've completed the analysis. It's available on our website. And the next phase in the process now is working on a spatial planning process, which we ultimately hope will lead us to an adaptation pathway, programmatic investment process for the city and the island. Just immediate uses out of that, we conducted a mapping exercise as part of the assessment, which was able to be used in the immediate response of the tsunami, which was an indication of the value of this kind of analysis. The government of Tonga is also planning some road infrastructure investments, including a bridge. So we've also been able to look at the bridge in the context of those future scenarios and putting that into consideration of future design and the decisions that are taken on investment. So I think that's an example for us.
Thank you, Noel, for highlighting the issue on lock-in. Maybe I'll go to Louise next. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you very much for the opportunity to be part of this panel. I'd like to share an example of some work that the FCDO, the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office in the UK, has been involved in various guises over the last several years, which is the Weather and Information Services for Africa, or the WISER program. And I wanted to share some information about WISER because I think it's a really good example for this discussion of a successful research program which has a lot of successful elements and which is actually now being scaled up, and there are plans to expand WISER for its next phase in Africa, but also into Asia and into the Pacific as well. So the WISER program was started in about 2015. And the goals of the program, multiple sort of development priorities for the program were to improve the production and dissemination of weather and climate information across Africa by working really closely with national Met and hydrological services, engaging really deeply with the community and forging really valuable partnerships, including, ongoing trusting relationships, which have been absolutely instrumental, I believe, to the program's success. And also, to lift people out of poverty by reducing, by providing more timely, more impact-based early warning and weather forecasts, helping people make better decisions, whether it's, their small holding farms or information even to improve urban planning in different cities. So yeah, just wanted to share information about that program and really delighted to be on this panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Lois, for highlighting the importance of trusted relationship. Walid, can we move to you? Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. One example came to my mind is nature-based solution. For instance, here, restoration of mangrove forest in coastal areas, which would help to avoid coastal erosion, one big problem, as you know. But by saying that, I can see three important points here. The first one, any adaptation solution have to be in the long run, because we are facing non-linear environmental impacts that would increase, and there's a lot of uncertainty about it. Second, should be effective in the way that we can see different co-benefit through nature-based solution. First, the benefit for the biodiversity, which is very important, and in terms of mitigation benefit by reforestation in large sense, but also nature-based solution can be, there's a social co-benefit of it. And finally, the third point, nature-based solution is cost-effective solutions, in the sense that you can have more important benefit from implementing nature-based solution. Unfortunately, nature-based solution in the ground is not something is largely used now, and we can see in the future important development for it, because there is, from economic point of view, environmental point of view, social point of view, there is a lot of benefit to follow this approaches. We can detail further if you want. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Walid, for highlighting the importance of NBS, specifically looking at the temporal scale, the core benefits it produces, and the cost effectiveness. Anne, over to you.
Great, thanks very much for this. So when I was thinking about this question and how best to answer it, we've come across some really interesting adaptation projects, whether it's sort of parametric insurance for fisher folk and small island communities. There was another example we had of a solar-powered mobile desalination plant to help with water availability in other small rural communities as well. We also, heard about another nature-based solution, to get to your point, showing a lot of promise. And so we were thinking about some of these specific projects, and then took a step back and realized, I'm here representing something called the National Adaptation Plan Global Network, or the NAP Global Network, which is hosted by IISD. And our business is essentially about the sort of institutional capacity for adaptation and adaptation effectiveness. And it really gets to internalizing and operationalizing this adaptation policy cycle that Pilar just mentioned in her opening statements. And so I think, we're about supporting developing countries and in sort of advancing their national adaptation planning processes. And I think we're seeing that if we want to see effective adaptation, and the IPCC actually even called this out earlier this year, that stronger governance is absolutely linked with more ambitious national adaptation plans and more effective implementation of adaptation. And so the NAP Global Network and the sort of partners that we work with is all about not only having more warm bodies working on adaptation in governments, but it is also setting up the coordination structures at government level, to not only across government, so that we can have different sectors working together, speaking to each other, so we can design and implement sometimes these hybrid type of solutions, a lot of them sometimes nature-based solutions, working with the Ministry of Infrastructure, for example, also with conservation authorities, along with agriculture and forestry, getting them to sort of work together and understand what the shared risks are and what the real opportunities are to address them together. So it's coming up with those institutional structures, but also looking at different levels of government. And I think really sort of making investments in that and not taking our eye off of that as we move forward will be absolutely critical to see effective adaptation scaled up.
Thank you, Anne. So, importance of adaptation planning, which looks at stronger coordination mechanisms, stronger institutional structure, and governance mechanism for planning purposes. Thank you. Yumiko-san.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for giving me opportunity to talk about the investment effectiveness of climate change adaptation. I would like to talk in terms of water, particularly to deal with national disaster risk, because Japan is facing severe issue to address flood control and reduce impact of flood impact, and is also for investment is also the priority and most concern in Asia Pacific. But the challenging is, water sector so far is water sector's project is so far has initiated by public works in top-down manner. So it is challenging to re-examine the current financial system architecture of water sector to meet the needs for adaptation, mobilizing public resources. And it is also tend to be the capital intensive with high front cost and long payback period. Therefore, it is not so much have incentive for private sector to conduct partnership for adaptation finance. And there is also that, and because of public oriented management in water sector, there is a lack of community and private sector's involvement. So it is preventing financial sector infrastructure from non-public sector for adaptation finance. So, but in order to mobilizing resources, it is important to the resources allocated for the ongoing management and operational issue of water sector, particularly water facility. In Asia Pacific region, challenging is to maintain the facility for sustainable manner, because it is lack of capacity and it is also lack of long-term view, how the society would like to make sociable development conducting the climate change adaptation. So in order to conduct adaptation measure effectively, it is necessary to envision what sort of society Asia Pacific region or each country or each community want to realize through implementing adaptation measures. So it is, but so far, as I mentioned, water sector is predominantly by public sector. So private sector or any non-governmental authority does not know where is the intervention point. So in order to define and make effective investment, it is important to have a fall of river basin management approach to address flood risk management. So fall of basin management system thinking will be helpful as a means to identify the multiple investment point within the local water cycle loop in conceptual and design phase. We can divide short, medium, and long-term water cycle loops and entirely water cycle. And by doing so, we can identify what sort of issues they have and what sort of stakeholder involved, and what sort of capacity is missing, and what sort of partnerships can be created to solve the issue and mobilizing resources to improve the effectiveness. And now I'd like to introduce the case of Japan. and Japan, adopted, reviving disaster resilience and sustainability by all. This policy is designed to take more proactive measures through the adoption of a whole-of-Beijing management approach and mobilizing resources from multi-stakeholders by enhancing disaster risk management to be done by the collaboration by all people in the society. New policy defines the River Beijing as a space consisting of watershed and floodplain area. The policy takes comprehensive and multi-layered action for three main purposes: flood prevention, exposure reduction, and disaster resilience. The new policy strengthens the implementation of non-structural measures more, such as guiding residents to live in lower-risk areas and promoting safer living by improving land risk information and reinforcing evacuation systems to minimize economic damage. To make adaptation investment effectively, it is also important to back up by measure of non-structural measures through concerted effort among all stakeholders. And next, in addition, it is also necessary to encourage people to recognize we need to build a society that can respond continually but under uncertainty change in the implementation phase. It will be effective to plan and implement no-regret or low-regret investment that yield benefit at minimum or low cost by taking integrated approach consist of structure and non-structure measures. It is important to ensure the investment and management of water-related infrastructure and technology are designed to be multi-purpose based on the appropriate science and technology, environmentally friendly and inclusive of all stakeholders. In case of Japan, there is one through River Beijing's practice is considered as effectiveness. It's also effectiveness for climate change adaptation, and it is also necessary effectiveness to enhance attractive city planning. Because the Yokohama, the Tsurumi River Beijing is next to the suburb of Tokyo, and so lots of economic its economy is very, very important to protect from the flood. But space is very limited to conduct flood control. That's why in order to make adaptation effectiveness and for disaster the purpose of disaster control, they make the function to conduct multiple use Retard Beijing by making the stadium, sports stadium. Then, but in making multi-purpose flood risk management is getting more costly. That's why they ask private sector to contribute to providing management financial support by giving name right for the investment. So this kind of supporting fund supporting budget for management continuously sustainable manner is also the important tool to bring new investment rather than just seeking about the mega financial mechanism. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Yumiko-san, for sharing experience from Japan, specifically in the context of including private sector, looking at non-structural measures and a whole of society approach. With that, Aslam, please.
Thank you very much. One of the important factors which I just want to touch base today for the adaptation investment to be effective and inclusive is how we see the role of the central finance agencies, the sectoral ministries. And for today, I just want to share with you examples from South Asia, where we from Asian Disaster Preparedness Center is working with the World Bank in supporting the government to improve the process of increasing the availability and utility of finance to implement plan adaptation actions. The way we are doing it, particularly in Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Nepal, is by utilizing the climate change financing frameworks to support mainstreaming of climate actions into public financing system through the utility of climate budget code and monitoring of climate expenditure. For example, in Nepal, we are working with the Ministry of Forest and Environment and Ministry of Finance to improve the utilization of climate budget code, as they are the entity responsible for coordinating climate change, ensuring efficiency in climate-related budget. We also helping the Ministry of Finance trying to understand how international financing for adaptation works so that they can access fund. In Pakistan, for example, we are working climate smart planning through integration and utility of climate indicators in pro forma planning documents, through which they actually are using and rolling out the climate change financing framework at the provincial and the local level. These are the three examples I just wanted to cite. More importantly, I think the role of the central financing agencies, the public policy ministries, and the sectoral ministries who are more responsible, it is important to have the coherence between them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Aslam, for highlighting the importance of central agencies. I think from this round, we are clearly seeing some common responses, and which is very much aligns and echoes what Pilar was saying too. The importance of looking at both the spatial as well as the temporal context of planning is very important. Looking at issues around governance, institutional capacity, coordination mechanisms, having trusted relationship with different partners, whole of society approach is critical. Bringing in both the central finance planning ministries, but also private sector becomes very, very critical if you want to design effective adaptation investment. Before I go into the next round of questions, I want to just turn to participants. If there anybody from the participants who would like to share your experiences on what you would consider as an effective adaptation solution or investment that you have been involved in. Anybody? Nobody? Yes. Raphael, please. I don't know if you have a microphone. Thank you.
Yeah, so thank you so much for sharing all this experience. And my name is Raphael Moser. Some of you already know me. So I'm from the local facility, which is hosted by UNCDF. So basically, the local facility, as the name suggests, works with the local level. So trying to bring finance, climate finance to the local level. At the same time, ensure effectiveness of the finance. Because it's not only, we have discussed a lot here at COP, that it's not only about increased access to finance, but also about the quality of that finance being channeled. And especially when it comes to the local level, where climate finance is not reaching, at least not at the flows that would be needed, because the adaptation needs are several. So the idea would be to use a mechanism which is then channeled through existing country systems, so not avoid somehow parallel approaches to finance. And then use the existing infrastructure in terms of national transfers from the national to the local level. So with the idea to transfer what we call, because UNCDF has a history of work with performance-based grants for the past 30 years. But that type of instrument was mostly used for capital development in general. So the idea was to use the same types of instruments for financing local adaptation, but then using country systems. So that's why some like sort of 1 decade ago, some 10 years, there was the first pilot of the local in Asia, in Cambodia and in Bhutan. And because of the success of that pilot, it somehow now reached 34 countries in the world, especially the least developed countries, the small island developing states, and in Africa. So it's about 34 countries, of which 27 are LDCs. And these are the countries which are mostly the most vulnerable to climate change, at the same time with the least capacity to actually respond. And when it comes to the local level, the capacities are even lower. So we really, so by using these instruments, which are very innovative because they ensure the programming, the verification of climate finance, attached to it, there are some indicators of performance that each local government receiving those grants, they need to comply with. And we don't look only at adaptation per se. Of course, it's an adaptation mechanism, but we also look at more of the basic safeguards to really ensure that local governments really have the readiness and the basic capacity to handle funds at the same level, at the same time. So it's on one hand, we somehow try to deepen the decentralization process in the country, so really plug into the existing systems. On the other hand, we also encourage local governments to improve their performance in terms of adaptation results. Because as we think about local adaptation, I mean, local governments are really best placed to really understand the needs of their communities. But of course, we need to make sure that there is a sort of right methodology to do that. Because if you don't apply the right methodology, the risk is really high. So local try to, somehow, as it increases access to finance, also work towards improving the capacities of local governments. At the same time, ensuring they also make sure that communities somehow have a voice in the decision-making process at the local level. Every year, so they receive grants. They get assessed at the end of each financial cycle, and depending on the score that you get out of that assessment, the subsequent allocations will then vary. So by doing that every year, you create a sort of positive competition among them, so they can improve, so learn by doing, improving every year. So every year we see a trend, upward trend in terms of improvements in performance. And so I just wanted to share that experience, which is now in 34 countries. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That's an excellent example of a financial instrument, which actually Pilar was also talking about earlier, to move beyond project financing. And in this case, you're using performance-based allocations to incentivize, adaptation investments at the local level. Anybody else want to share an experience or example of an effective adaptation investment or initiative? Or something that went wrong? Yes, please. Can we have the microphone? Sorry. Thanks, Tanguy.
Hi. Oh, hello. Donald Lennon from DAI. I was interested by the panel. We've used insurance, particularly microinsurance, quite effectively in a number of areas of driving finance to the local level, and I was interested that nobody picked up on that in the panel. So I just wanted to reflect on that I'd be interested to hear people's views of utilising microfinance. Cheers.
Great, thanks. We'll try to cover that. So maybe I'll go for the next round. I'll start with you, Anne, because you talked about the national adaptation planning process. Of course, the planning process is essential to help countries work with a large range of stakeholders to identify the adaptation priorities. How do we ensure that the adaptation planning process itself embeds principles that would be critical for effective adaptation investments?
Yeah, so I think, I think in undertaking national adaptation planning processes, what we're finding, time and time again, is that there's a recognition by a lot of our national government partners that, no matter what the priorities are that are identified, first of all, priorities can't be identified without effective consultation and engagement with other parts of government, other levels of government, and different stakeholder groups. That's come out clearly. And so that might sound like it leads to a process of a lot of consultation, and there's probably a sense of consultation fatigue. But I think that we've seen in recent years especially some really interesting and innovative and creative ways to engage different stakeholders. It's basically, we're talking about readiness for implementation. If you're talking to communities that ultimately are most affected by the impacts of climate change and who are going to be called upon to implement the actions that are contained within a national adaptation plan, then we need to be working with them from day one, right? And so we've had some really interesting examples of where governments will do sort of, as part of their planning process, not even their implementation process, but as they're part of their planning process to go to communities or go to local governments and undertake an engagement process of not just sort of raising awareness around adaptation or the NAP process, but really trying to get inputs of local experiences, local priorities, and traditional and indigenous and local knowledge of what not only how climate is affecting them, but what solutions have been implemented to monitor changes in the environment, to sort of think about different livelihood strategies that are working under different environmental situations, and how can these inform and kind of feed upwards into the national conversation. And so this sort of vertical integration, and this really speaks to what Raphael was talking about, is sort of this multi-level governance. And he was giving an example of finance, but it's also sort of it's a bigger conversation, right? It's about understanding the priorities and the perspectives and the different types of information and knowledges. So I would really sort of highlight the engagement in the vertical integration as being critical to really sort of setting governments and countries up for effective implementation of adaptation action.
Thank you, Anne, for highlighting the importance of effective consultation mechanism itself in the planning process. And you very rightly said about how this is important because it actually makes you ready for implementation, and that's absolutely critical. Let me move to Luis. You have been involved in the physical climate risk assessment, the science side of it, of course. And of course, as Noel was earlier saying, in many ways, science forms the basis to identify what investments should be going in or what should not be going in. So from your perspective, how do we ensure the climate risk assessment, which is itself a process in many ways, how that embodies some principles which ultimately leads to effective identification of investments?
Yeah, thank you for the question. And I think as many of the panelists and our audience even have kind of emphasized today, is that we need to be making sure that the adaptation solutions that are being implemented are of really high quality, and that they're going to go the distance, that they're going to result in kind of longer term resilience building. And so to do that, we really do need to draw on the latest science, the latest information about how our climate, has already changed. Draw on local people's lived experiences of what that looks like and how, that has affected them already, because we have already seen, a lot of changes in our climate. And planning that uses information, that is decades old, is actually setting ourselves up, for failure. And so one of the big, or one of the evidence gaps here then is for those locations, those regions and those communities that don't have access, to good climate information that tells us how climate has already changed in that region, and what needs to happen in what is likely to happen in the future, and that then informs sustainable development options, adaptation options. So maybe just to share an example of something that I think is a process where that climate information has been really well integrated with local knowledge, with local partnerships and local governance structures, is some work in Africa through the Future Climate for Africa program. I'm thinking specifically of an example in the city of Lusaka in Zambia, where there's an issue with urban flooding, particularly for informal settlements, a group that may not traditionally have a lot of agency in local governance and things like that. But through using the science and the research as a forum to bring these groups together, talking about what the flooding impacts already are, bringing that together with what sorts of things the community might need to be prepared for in the future. That has been a really successful multi- and transdisciplinary exercise where there's now a very engaged and well-informed group that's had that capacity and capability aspect to it, and they're now developing plans for development in Lusaka and what to do for future floods. So thank you, I'll leave it there.
Thank you. I think you highlighted two very important points. One is how the climate risk assessment process, when it's done through interdisciplinary and multi-stakeholder way, it not only provides you the response in terms of the understanding of risk, but he also talked about how it provides agency to the perhaps the most people who are left out of the decision-making process, and in many ways empowers them to identify the risk and potentially negotiate adaptation solutions with other partners. But I strongly understand from your point also that, which means that there should also be sufficient investments going in doing such climate risk assessments, which are itself, could be quite, expensive. But I think that's very important to prioritize it, because if we don't have it, then we will not have the adaptation solutions that are coming out to be effective. So thank you so much for highlighting that. Aslam, if I can move on to you. I think Pilar talked about a lot that in the recent discussions on adaptation, we're hearing more about equity, about justice, about, how do you address social considerations. So when designing adaptation investments, how do you make sure these social considerations are adequately factored in, and it ultimately contributes to more equitable outcomes? Sorry.
Yeah, thank you again. I think let me begin with the ongoing work that we are doing. We are engaged in almost 24 countries in the East Asia and Pacific region, primarily the low-income group countries, trying to look at the different policies, strategies, and plans vis-a-vis the climate action commitments, and where does all these human development sectors, primarily education, health, social protection and job, and gender, how the different sectoral policy programs as well as the commitment in the NDC and the NAPAs are connected. I must tell you, because I myself has screened more than 200 different documents, there is a disjoint. And the disjoint is that, like, I just give you an example, particularly from the East Asia side, the evidence of the impact of heat, air pollution, and other climate-related risks on human capital, both in terms of short and long term, yet to be mainstream in human development sectors. For number of sectoral program and policies, how we really incorporate the risk information, as Pilar mentioned, is not supported by what would be the cost for it. So there are a number of strategies and policies which talks about how to incorporate right-based, inclusive, and more gender equity-based approaches, but it does not really provide how much it will cost. And primarily for some of the countries, it is very difficult, again, for the policy and the finance ministries to allocate resources back to it. So in order for us to be more effective, I think the way I believe that we really have to look beyond endpoint vulnerabilities if we really are looking for equity considerations. And the way my colleagues here mentioned that it is important for us to incorporate climate-related risk information with these social vulnerabilities into the different phases of the budgeting as well, not only in terms of identifying the risk and putting it into the different commitment documents. Thank you.
Thank you. So that's very clear. I mean, starting from the climate risk assessment process, which has to reflect the social vulnerabilities, leading to wider planning and budgeting process, which then has to allocate adequate resources for addressing such underlying drivers of vulnerability, and that ultimately hopefully leads to some investments which factor it also holistically. Imiko-san, very, very briefly, from water perspective, because that's where the area of your expertise, governance is of course very critical. And we also heard from earlier from Anne, from other colleagues, about governance is critical for adaptation, effective adaptation solution. So what sort of governance mechanisms you are seeing in the water space, which is promoting an effectiveness of adaptation investments?
Thank you. It is important important to make the governance mechanism which it is important to make the governance system, governance mechanism which all multi-stakeholders involved in the decision-making process. In water sector, it's, the governance is very, very fragmented because, there are various water fields which we need to conduct the measure for climate adaptation or even for development assistance is very huge. And the word they are using is also very different, and the goal is also very, very, very different. So there are not while people understand the importance for collaboration, it is challenging for particularly for national government or local government to conduct the partnerships in different sectors. So, in order to enhance governance mechanism effectiveness, role of science and information, and also role of the facilitator, that being the catalytic being who can lead the way for resolving problems faced in each sector by providing professional advice on site to tailor locally diverse climate, geographic, and socio-economic conditions. It is also very important, to make more easier to connect the every national government stakeholders about the connection between the various global initiatives about the climate adaptation and Sendai Disaster Framework (SDG). So, because these initiatives is discussing similar thing, but each government organization who is taking the responsibility of global initiative is very different. So people does not know what sort of discussion it is conducted under the different global agenda. So it is important to foster the facilitator who can bring all different perspective is related for each sectors. Thank you.
Thank you for highlighting the very critical point of the synergies between different institutions or actors at national, local, but also synergies between different mechanisms at regional and global level, so these these agendas can come together. Noel, if I can move on to you, of course, from ADB's perspective, we do investments at certain scale, and we heard from the other panelists some of the features that you think can contribute to effective adaptation investment. How do you think we can carry it forward in ADB's investments?
Thanks, Orgo, and I'll come back to that, but I just do want to acknowledge the question on insurance from the floor. At ADB, it is an approach we incorporate into our work. One such example is work that we're doing on a coral reef insurance covering the Fiji, Solomon Islands, Indonesia, and Philippines. So an index-based cover which can release payouts after there are storms of particular strength, and working with communities so they're pre-prepared on how to reseed the coral. That's work still ongoing, and trying to figure out mechanisms for also making sure that there are greater benefits to the community as part of that mechanism. So coming back to the work, and let me acknowledge first that Orgo is the key actor in our adaptation work at ADB, and we've been working on some key principles to guide the development of our adaptation investments, and to ensure that these investments are effective and steer development in resilient directions. So we've heard a lot about the adaptation plans. So our adaptation investments need to be directly aligned with the priorities identified in national policies and plans, such as the adaptation. And we've heard about the importance of the consultative process for those plans. Two such examples are the work that we heard recently from the Secretary of the Ministry of Environment, Forestry and Climate Change of Bangladesh. They've approved the National Adaptation Plan, and that's been developed over a 2-year period with extensive consultation with the government, local government agencies, local government and communities. And also we've heard through Tina Stege recently just on the in-depth consultation process that's happening for the adaptation plan for the Marshall Islands. So by aligning our adaptation investments with such plans, we can ensure that ADB responds to the needs of the country. We've heard a lot about the climate risk assessment also. So at ADB, our investments should be formulated by robust climate risk assessments of at the wider system level. This includes understanding hazards and their longer term trends, exposure of assets and people, and the socioeconomic vulnerabilities of the systems, for example, gender norms. And one such example of our work on that area is in Vietnam, where we're currently developing a project in provinces that have large numbers of ethnic minorities. So before deciding on the infrastructure that ADB will finance, we undertook a province-level climate risk assessment to understand both the climate and the socio-economic hotspots. This then helps us to determine the type of investment needed to build resilience in the province. The other point is our investments really need to promote transformational change. And while we recognize that not all investments may provide equal opportunity for promoting transformation, especially in some cases they may not be economically viable, nevertheless, all adaptation investments can support activities around risk-sensitive planning to promote adaptation management practices. We can have institutional strengthening, we can have risk-informed asset management practices, etc., to promote the transformational change. Our recently approved project, Bangladesh, will be supporting 22 coastal towns to address risk-sensitive urban master planning processes. We've also heard about the importance of financial management in local level adaptation planning, and I think it's important within this to remember how significant the ownership of that financial decision making can be for communities. And just the last two principles, which I'll just mention but not go into detail, are we need to have outcome level indicators for investments. And last Saturday we had the launching of the MDB joint methodology on estimating climate adaptation finance. So we want to make sure that our investments are aligned with that guidance. So thank you.
Thank you, Noel, and thanks for highlighting the importance of metrics, and that's why I'll go to you. From OECD's perspective, of course, measuring effectiveness largely depends on how you define outcomes to be and what metrics do you use. So any experience you would like to share from OECD's perspective on how do we design such metrics and how do we, more importantly, embed them in wider country planning budgeting systems so that ultimately they can inform the investments that have much more impact?
Well, measuring adaptation is a really complex issue. It's not so simple. But let me start by saying which more important here at this regard. We keep the idea that adapting is first building capacity for climate resilience. That's in the long run that we have to adapt our society, our economies to the environmental, to the climate impacts. Now, coming to the measurement, we are talking about the outcomes, but it could be also measuring the inputs. So the policy effort at the national level, at the local level, in terms of, for instance, public spending in adaptation. That's one good indicator. But it could also relate to how we deal or we dealt with some environmental risks. Like we talked about the risk assessment. So you have different perspective in the measurement. But which matter more, now it's the question, if you want to measure, means that you have to set indicators, but regarding objectives. So the question of the measurement is secondary when it comes to adaptation strategy or policy, because then you will need to define your vision, your strategy in terms of adaptation. And then the question of measurement becomes to say, how is the gap between what I'm doing now and my objectives in the timeline that I dedicated? Said like this, things seems to be simple, but in the reality, as we are dealing with different risks that we are adapting in different geographical contexts with different environmental impacts, then how all this come together? So you cannot go with one measurement, you need a battery of management. So first, define your objective, think about the timeline of your objective. Second, define families of indicators that can help. In the OECD, we made a survey across our member countries to understand where they are in the implementation of the adaptation policies, but also what they are doing in terms of measurements. So we are now dealing with addressing this, the results of the survey, and we can see clearly there's a problem of understanding first the implementation of the adaptation strategy. Because who design the adaptation strategy? Often it's the national government. Who implement? Often local stakeholders. And that's make first gap and needs kind of vertical coordination. Then also you have different sectors which involve, in addition to the local authorities, some businesses, investors, that they have to look at the situation in the place where they are going. I think the question on insurance is really important because here it's not beyond the risk assessment how we regulate the insurance, because some areas when we have a lack of information about the risk and how the government or the public authorities are dealing with this risk, then the insurance it become a tricky issue and it needs more reflection. That said, I think we should keep ongoing the reflection on the measurement, because any policy action, including the one on adaptation, will need accountability. We should say how much we are doing there. There's international commitment, there's a national commitment, a local commitment, but to say we are doing well, everyone can say, I'm doing well, I'm doing good adaptation policy, I have a strategy, but show where you are. And make progress means you make it in a comparative way. This is why in the OECD we try to have a comparative approach, just to compare efforts between countries, between sectors, between different regions. And then one big problem, and I will finish with that because I believe the aggregation of the information, that's the big issue in terms of measurement of adaptation. We would see a number saying that's the effort that you are doing in terms of adaptation, because all of you, maybe you are making the parallel with mitigation. In mitigation, we have one indicator, we know, cutting down CO2 emission. But with adaptation, that would not be easy. Some approach say, let's look to the public budget. See the chair dedicated for adaptation. But this is not enough eventually, because we need more reflection on it. That's my take.
Thank you, Walid, for clearly articulating the importance of defining objectives, looking at a family of indicators. At the end of the day, it's all about accountability, and that's the basis for adaptation metrics, and much work needs to happen. Let me now turn to the participants. If there are any specific questions to the panelists, any suggestions, inputs from your side. As I mentioned earlier on, this is a very new topic, at least for us, so we're always very keen to hear from you guys. Anybody? Yes, please.
Hi. For those involved in selecting adaptation projects to fund, what characteristics make a project more appealing to you?
Okay, what characteristics makes more appealing to finance an adaptation project? Anybody from the panel? Please. And then followed by Noel.
Thank you, and thank you very much for the question. So just reflecting on a process that we are going through at the moment at FCDO, we are funding, in partnership with IDRC in Canada, a over £100 million climate and adaptation and resilience program, and we've been sifting through just an enormous amount of proposals for that funding amount. So just to give you an idea of the kind of scale of the demand for funding for adaptation and resilience programs. For a final pool of less than probably 20, we had over 1,500 applications from across the world. But some of the kind of thinking that we're using to guide us in our appraisal of proposals, certainly we're looking at, the scientific rigour and foundation of proposals as well. We want to see that they are, grounded in really solid science, that they're drawing on the latest information and things like that. But it's also been really important when funding these sorts of things to look at, like, who is involved? What does the partnerships look like? Are we seeing good opportunities here for knowledge exchange and for capability development and capacity building and things like that? We have an explicit gender equity and inclusion criteria for this as well. And, gender is very important, but really also looking towards inclusivity for other marginalised groups. And so, a whole range of things need to come together, as we all know, to make a successful project, and a project that is, has a good chance of being scalable, being able to transcend perhaps different regions, different cultures, temporal scales and things like that. And also that, like I said before, that's going to potentially have good co-benefits and hit some of these multiple development priorities at once. Thanks.
Thank you, Louise. Noel, do you want to add?
I think I will be repeating a lot of the same points, but I think that, that the risk-informed aspects, the really, in our context where it's sovereign ownership, there's very strong ownership at the national government, local level. Also, the gender dimensions. We want to be sure that any of the investments are putting us on a long-term pathway, and they're compatible with future long-term investments, and making sure that there's none of that lock-in, no maladaptations associated with it. And I think also bringing more, as we move forward, bringing together much more the multi-sectoral dimension, both the hard and the soft aspects. So back to you, Orgo.
Thank you, Noel. Any other questions, suggestions? Yes, oh great, please. First you and then, yeah, okay.
Hi, thank you so much for speaking today. I was wondering how you approach local projects where there may be a disjuncture between the local government and the local actors and the national government. So what happens if local needs don't flow up through the national government? How do you provide financing, or is that a non-starter?
Can we get the next question also? Then we can. Thank you.
Mine was just a comment and a potential resource. My name's Richard Florzone. I'm CEO of IISD, so I'm very pleased to work with Anne and our NAP Global Network. I just wanted to talk about, for a moment, about the question of valuation. So many adaptation interventions, like when you talked about Tonga, will involve some investment in infrastructure or nature-based solutions of some sort. And one of the things we found is we think it's really important to be able to value, not just economically, but all of the co-benefits. So we partnered with the GEF, the Global Environment Facility, I just wanted to say, to create something called the Global Center for Nature-Based Infrastructure, where we have a valuation tool called Savvy that tries to evaluate all these co-benefits, and we're building up a catalog of case studies and trying to do peer-to-peer learning to kind of share the knowledge on the valuation, which is kind of a precondition to getting that kind of investment in either traditional or gray or green infrastructure that can build climate resilience. Thanks very much.
Thanks for sharing that. Anybody wants to take the first question? And do you want to, Walid? Anybody? Okay, can you repeat the question? We couldn't hear it properly. Yes, please.
Thank you very much. My name is Alexandra Vogel, and I'm working with the Asian Development Bank. And your question on national local governments, I just want to give you one example of Bangladesh, a project I was working on, which was an urban governance and infrastructure improvement project. So this was kind of a loan we gave to the sovereign national government, but then it triggered down to the local governments, to the Burashavas, which are small towns across Bangladesh. And the idea was, like, we supported more than 60 small towns with infrastructure improvements based on their governance performance. So the combination that we wanted is to kind of increase the capacity of local governments to manage their community. We also have helped them to establish committees to involve the community, and based on their performance and the performance criteria, they were provided with infrastructure investment grants. And there also we had a lot of we started to build a lot of urban climate change resilience into the designs as well, and also did a lot of capacity, risk assessment, capacity development. So that was quite a big national project, which actually triggered down to the local government. Thank you.
Thank you, Alexandra. Is there any, do you have a question? No. Okay, all right. Yeah. If there are no other questions, then I will not dare to wrap, but I think I want to comment on a couple of things from you, which is very important, which came out in the panel. Of course, the whole idea was to discuss what makes an adaptation investment effective. But what I heard very clearly from the panel is, even if before we reach that stage of making an investment effective, there is a whole bunch of things that need to happen much more upstream to ensure we are getting the right type of investment. So we heard about ensuring planning processes are looking at longer term risk, the whole spatial and temporal context, heard about importance of institutional coordination at national, local level, between national and regional and global level. We heard about making these processes much more inclusive, as well as to include private sector, for example. And these becomes absolutely critical if we want to identify the right type of investments. And then once we come to the investment, and of course, looking at a whole range of solutions, starting from gray infrastructure to nature-based solutions, to looking at insurance solutions, etc. And ultimately then leading to how do you then monitor, evaluate, and learn from this process. But for me, the key message for today's was, if you want adaptation solutions and investments to be effective, then the planning, financing, implementation, and monitoring, this really needs to be seen as one part of the wider system and needs to be looked together. Currently, I strongly feel there are different partners who come in different aspects of this process, which is good because of their own expertise. But if we really want to shift and ensure ultimately our outcomes are effective, then all these partners need to come together and be consistently involved in the entire process, no matter what role you play, because then only we ensure that the entire process of planning to financing to implementation to monitoring is contributing to equitable and effective outcomes, which clearly means we do need a new model in which we do adaptation in most countries. And I think this is an important thing, at least from ADB's point of view, to take back, that we, as a financial institution, we can't just expect to come and finance a particular project if we are not sufficiently involved upstream to help create the right enabling environment for such projects, and to downstream to build capacity of local governments and communities to implement such projects. So with that, thank you from my side to all the panelists. Nankeef, over to you.
I think, Orgo, thank you. Thank you for moderating an excellent panel. And to all the panelists, those were great remarks. And also thank you to the audience for sitting through an hour and a half, but also for engaging actively with the discussion. So thank you, and I'd like to conclude this session with that.
Okay. Yeah, no, that's okay, just no problem. Yes. We actually, and Louisa, in the Pacific Pavilion at 5 today, no.